Did you know the president can deploy military troops into your state? I mean, even if the governor fights back? And why that raw federal power is now really central to fighting rampant crime and securing the border? Today, we're doing a deep dive into exactly that. The deployment of the National Guard to U.S. cities, sometimes bypassing state governors entirely. We'll explore the fierce constitutional debate swirling around presidential authority versus, state sovereignty. We're going deep into the sources shared by one listener who wants to understand the actual legal justification behind these controversial but sometimes politically necessary actions.
Yeah, and this isn't just some abstract legal theory we're batting around. It actually played out in a really high-stakes, real-world situation. We're looking specifically at when President Trump activated, what was it, about 2,000 California National Guard troops into Los Angeles.
2,000, wow.
Yeah, and importantly, this was done using Title X federal authority, which meant it happened despite the, let's say, strong objection of Governor Gavin Newsom.
Okay, that sounds like a recipe for conflict right there. What was the immediate spark? What forced the president's hand to take such a, drastic step?
Well, the sources show this mobilization followed a period of escalating violence and unrest there in Los Angeles, the immediate trigger. It seems to have been violent riots that were sparked by federal law enforcement, specifically ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
ICE.
Right. They'd arrested over 100 individuals for, quote, specific criminal activity during some targeted immigration raids.
So wait, the federal government was just enforcing federal immigration law, doing its job, and then violence erupted.
That's how the sources frame it, yes.
Yeah.
The president asserted that this federal mobilization was necessary. Why? To protect federal officers and federal property, especially against what they termed domestic threats and, rampant lawlessness in a place, California, that many critics argued was essentially creating the conditions for this chaos through sanctuary policies and a refusal to cooperate with federal law.
So the administration's argument was basically that state and local officials weren't doing enough. Or maybe even enabling the problem.
Pretty much. That they were failing to maintain order or defend federal interests operating within their state.
And Governor Newsom, predictably, he pushed back hard, called it unlawful, a serious breach of state sovereignty.
So that really sets up the core tension we need to unpack, doesn't it? When local authority seems to break down, or maybe just disagrees with federal policy, how far can the executive branch actually go using military power to restore order or enforce its laws?
That's the million-dollar question. And to answer it, we have to understand this constitutional tightrope walk. The founders, they were deeply worried about centralized military power. The original idea, the design, was for a highly decentralized military structure. State militias were meant to be the primary force for domestic issues. Right, the sources definitely point that out. People like Patrick Henry, the anti-federalists, they really feared a permanent federal standing army that wasn't accountable to the states. They worried state militias would eventually just be put completely into the hands of the president, as they put it.
Exactly. And that fear wasn't just paranoia. It was kind of the whole point of having state militias to act as a check, a safeguard against federal overreach. But as the sources detail, that original check, it's been systematically weakened, you could say, over the last century or so. We really have to look at legislative changes like the Dick Act of 1903, and even more critically, the system we have now of dual enlistment.
Okay, dual enlistment. That sounds important. For anyone not familiar, how does that mechanism really change a state's control over its own National Guard unit?
Well, it's the key mechanism, really. It basically turns the state's own asset into the federal government's ready reserve force. So when someone joins the National Guard today, they're automatically enlisted in both the state militia and a federal reserve component, like the Army Reserve or Air National Guard, which is federal.
Ah, okay. So you're serving two masters, in a way.
In a sense. And because of federal funding, federal training standards, federal equipment, modern state guard units, according to these sources, generally just can't function independently of the federal government in any significant way anymore.
So the feds kind of built this structure, funding it, training it, largely at state expense, you might argue, where they can effectively take control whenever they deem it necessary. Okay, so let's break down the two main legal authorities that govern using the military domestically. We need to understand the normal way and then this presidential power play.
Right. So the normal operation, the one governors prefer, is called a Title 32 deployment.
Title 32.
Correct. Under Title 32 of the U.S. Code, the National Guard troops remain under the direct command and control of the state governor. The federal government often foots the bill, especially for things like border support or disaster relief. But the governor is the boss. It preserves state sovereignty.
Okay, that makes sense. Governor's control, maybe federal funding, but then there's this president's trump card, as you called it.
That's Title 10. Specifically, Title 10 U.S. Code Section 12406. This is a big one. This law allows the president to unilaterally call the National Guard into federal service. That means they immediately stop being state troops and become federal troops under his command.
Unilaterally, even if the governor objects.
Even if the governor actively objects, yes. The president can do this if he considers it necessary to, and these are the key phrases: repel the invasion, suppress the rebellion, or execute those laws.
Execute those laws. That sounds pretty broad.
It can be. So in the California example, when Governor Newsom refused to deploy the Guard under state control under Title 32, which he did,
Right.
the president just invoked Title 10, federalized them. But hang on, we absolutely have to talk about the big restriction on using the military domestically, the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878.
Yes, okay, good point. That's the law that generally forbids using the Army or Air Force for civilian law enforcement, right?
Yeah.
Like making arrests, general riot control.
Exactly. It's meant to be the firewall, keep the military out of return policing. So the question becomes, how did the Trump administration deploy 2,000 federalized troops into L.A. without violating Posse Comitatus?
Especially since the whole situation was triggered by federal law enforcement agents, ICE, doing their jobs. This is that legal tightrope walk you mentioned.
This is where it gets really interesting, legally speaking. The administration's argument was very specific. They claimed the federalized Guard was deployed only in a limited support role.
Support role, meaning what exactly?
Meaning they were doing things like protecting federal assets, maybe guarding ICE facilities or federal courthouses, providing logistical help, transportation, maybe even clerical stuff like data entry for the federal agents involved. Critically, they argued the troops were not performing direct law enforcement duties themselves. They weren't arresting rioters. They weren't patrolling the streets like police.
Okay. So because they were protecting the enforcers, the ICE agents and their property, and not acting as the enforcers themselves, the deployment technically, legally, sidestepped the Posse Comitatus Act.
Precisely. That's the argument. It's the difference between, say, a Guard member standing outside a federal building guarding the doors, which is generally allowed, versus that same Guard member going out and arresting someone for vandalism, which is generally prohibited by Posse Comitatus.
So it hinges entirely on that distinction, support versus direct action.
It does. And that legal distinction becomes the entire justification, the linchpin, for the executive action. By carefully defining the deployment as purely defensive and supportive of ongoing federal operations, they argued they could legally execute federal law in this case, supporting immigration enforcement without crossing that line into prohibited military policing.
That's some sophisticated legal maneuvering. And it really highlights the immense power that seems to be concentrated now in the executive branch. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Moving from the legal justification to the political necessity argument. Supporters, as the sources show, frame these kinds of deployments as absolutely essential, right, to uphold law and order.
Yes, especially in response to what they saw as Democratic leaders' failures to control crime in their own cities, failures to address the spiraling crisis of mass illegal immigration.
The conservative viewpoint in the sources is pretty blunt about it.
It is. The argument is clear. The federal government must step in when cities become, as they put it, sanctuaries for lawlessness. Republicans argued quite openly that this Title 10 deployment in California was necessary because state officials refused to act, essentially letting the situation spiral out of control and then criticizing the federal effort to restore order.
And this idea of lawlessness, according to the sources, wasn't just seen as like random crime. They connect it to political rhetoric, don't they?
They do. They discuss what they see as a dangerous atmosphere surrounding federal law enforcement, particularly ICE. The sources point to examples where Democratic political figures are accused of using extremely inflammatory language.
Like comparing ICE to the Gestapo or slave patrols, that kind of thing.
Exactly, that kind of rhetoric. And the sources cite data reporting a staggering 700% increase in violence against ICE agents during certain periods. That's the figure cited. And critics argue this violence is a direct consequence of this kind of polarized anti-law enforcement rhetoric coming from the left. So the argument follows. When local leaders demonize federal agents who are just trying to enforce federal law, it becomes necessary, even obligatory, for the federal government to use tools like Title X to protect its own personnel from what they might see as state-enabled or state-condoned violence.
Which leads directly to that charge of political hypocrisy that the sources really emphasize. They contrast the fierce opposition to Trump using Title X for immigration enforcement with past actions by Democratic officials when they wanted the Guard.
Yeah, that's a major point in these sources. The example that comes up repeatedly is the situation in Martha's Vineyard, where the National Guard was deployed quite rapidly to help move, I think it was about 50 illegal immigrants off the island.
Right, I remember that.
So critics argue, look, wealthy Democratic enclaves were practically begging for the National Guard when they felt even slightly burdened by the consequences of open border policies. But then when President Trump uses the federalized Guard to actually enforce federal immigration policy, the very laws being violated, suddenly it's branded an unlawful power grab and a violation of state sovereignty. They see a double standard there.
Okay, but let's play devil's advocate for a second. What about the counter-argument from the state sovereignty side? Even if the role is just support, isn't using Title X like this setting a potentially dangerous precedent?
Oh, absolutely. That is the core of the pushback. Those criticizing the Title X move argue it crosses a really hazardous political and constitutional line. They'd say that using federalized troops, even if they're just doing logistics or guarding buildings to manage what are essentially domestic civil disputes or disagreements over immigration policy, well, that's a militarization of the political process.
Militarizing politics. Okay.
Right. They argue it fundamentally damages the whole federal-state relationship. And crucially, it normalizes the idea that the president can just override the will of a state governor on domestic matters using military force, albeit federalized state force.
Yeah. So wrapping this up, what does this all really mean for the future balance of power between the states and the federal government?
Well, it means we are watching in real time the president using that centralized military authority, the very kind the founders worried about, to enforce specific federal laws, especially around immigration and crime control, and doing so in places where local authorities explicitly, politically, oppose those federal laws. The deployment gets legally justified through this careful support role definition, framed as restoring order, where, in the federal government's view, local policy has failed.
And the sources seem to confirm that fundamental shift in power, the one the anti-federalists were warning about centuries ago.
They really do. The expansion of federal military power, driven by laws like the Dick Act, fueled by dual enlistment, maybe accelerated by modern security threats, it has fundamentally occurred at the expense of state power. Now, those supporting these federal deployments argue this centralization is absolutely necessary today. They'd say, how else do you combat modern crises like mass migration or, rising lawlessness in major cities if local governments won't act?
So it confirms the fear.
It simultaneously confirms that historic fear, that the central government has effectively gained almost total control over the nation's military assets, even state militias, especially in times of domestic crisis. And maybe this brings us to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to chew on. This blurring of the National Guard's status, this Title X power, it hasn't just transferred authority from the states to the federal government. You could argue it's transferred power specifically from Congress to the president. Think about it. If a president can unilaterally invoke Title X, federalize state troops, and deploy them domestically to execute laws potentially without needing new specific congressional authorization for that mission, and definitely without gubernatorial consent, how much power has permanently shifted to the executive branch? And maybe the deeper question is, does the perceived crisis of lawlessness or border insecurity justify accepting that concentration of power, that loss of state control, that potential erosion of congressional authority? Something to consider.